When cheating is revealed, males always ask, did you sleep with him? And females always ask, do you love her? So you have to see if that's true in your own experience of movies. Like I said, I'm just not a movie person, so I have to just pass on what other people who do this research claim. So that's not strong evidence, but if it was true, that would be interesting. We have, though, this kind of evidence from the study of different cultures. And this is just to sort of get us thinking about what social psychologists interested in sex, love, and attraction are thinking about. As we'll see, a lot of what has consumed their research attention has been trying to document and understand differences between men and women in how sex, love, and attraction works from a psychological and to some degree a physical perspective. And so the reason to start with this big male-female difference in survey data across 37 cultures is that social psychologists interested in this topic by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, have been interested in understanding social psychological processes related to male-female differences in sex, love, and attraction. A primary explanatory framework that social psychologists have used to try to understand male-female differences in sex, love, and attraction is an evolutionary psychology perspective. And I brought this up very briefly on the first day of class as one of the primary perspectives that social psychologists have used, but this is really our first opportunity to see a research topic where it's been very prominent. So this and altruism are probably the two topics in the whole semester where we'll see the strongest influence of an evolutionary psychology perspective. So I want to tell you about sort of the basic idea of that perspective, and then we'll see how it has been applied to the study of sex, love, and attraction, and specifically the male-female differences. The core principle of an evolutionary psychology approach, as applied to social psych or really any other type of psychology, is that what matters in terms of understanding current behavior is who among our ancestors had their genes passed along and the qualities that led them to be successful in reproducing and thus passing along their genes. What the evolutionary psychology argument is basically that what we have inherited from our ancestors are the characteristics associated with reproductive success. People who were alive at the time of our ancestors, some of them had certain qualities that seem to have been associated with successfully reproducing. Those people became our ancestors. Those are the genes that we've inherited. Other people alive at those same times had other characteristics or other qualities that for some reason were not as associated with successful reproduction. And those people did not become our ancestors. Their genes did not get passed down to us, and we did not inherit their behavioral tendencies. So the idea of the evolutionary psychology framework is that our current behavior is a reflection of the behavioral tendencies we've inherited that were associated with reproductive success among our ancestors. You can imagine right from the beginning the research difficulties this brings up. As much as we will see that in some cases it makes a perhaps compelling story, it will also be the case that evolutionary psychologists have a real research problem because they are basically making the claim that our current behavior is a product of behavioral tendencies associated with reproductive success of our ancestors. Of course, they cannot go and do random assignment of our ancestors or really any other paradigm with them. There are very few paradigms that we can use on people who are dead. So, this constrains the ability of evolutionary psychologists to directly test their hypotheses. And what you'll see is that they use other ways of testing their hypotheses. They look at current behavior and see if it matches their prediction, their evolutionary predictions. But there's always this problem that they can never really go and specifically test the mechanism. And so for any number of reasons, evolutionary psychology is controversial. Some of you may find it really interesting and compelling. Some of you may think it's all a load of crap and think that there's no basis at all and that it just regurgitates societal stereotypes. I leave that to you to decide. But it is an important, it's an important perspective. It's quite prominent now in social psychology, and it's important for us to grapple with. So when thinking about behavioral characteristics that would have been associated with reproductive success among our ancestors, one thing that evolutionary psychologists think about is that behaviors that solve biological problems or are adapted to biological constraints will be ones that are especially likely to be associated with reproductive success. And if they're associated with reproductive success, the genes of the people who've done those things get passed on to us, and we inherit those behavioral tendencies because those are the genes that we end up with. And so what they're going to try to do in understanding male-female differences in sexual behavior is to think about male-female differences in sort of across the board, and how current-day male-female differences in sexual behavior may have been adaptive responses to biological problems and biological constraints, because they're going to want to argue that male-female differences reflect differences in what was associated with successful reproduction among our male and female ancestors. Basically, the idea is going to be that the characteristics, the behaviors that would lead our male ancestors and our female ancestors to be reproductively successful and thus to pass along their genes, they're different. So to the extent that different qualities were needed for male ancestors and female ancestors to successfully reproduce and pass along their genes, then we would have inherited different tendencies, and you end up with male-female differences today in behavior. So the question is always, who was reproductively successful? Whose genes did we inherit? As we'll see again in the study of altruism, it's sort of a weird thing to think about. Who was reproductively successful who passed along their genes, but there are ways of thinking about it. So what does an evolutionary psychologist think about this male-female difference in concern with sexual cheating versus emotional cheating? Well, what they would argue is that male-female difference in attitude reflects the effects of male-female differences in the biological situation of reproduction. So what evolutionary psychologists would argue is that men and women in the reproductive process have different biologically based problems to solve. And so their behavior is an adaptation to the particular biological problems that males and females are differentially trying to solve. For human females, one biological problem in terms of successful reproduction is what you might call a resource problem. As we'll talk about in another way a little bit later today, reproduction is a very time-consuming thing for the mother. So in addition to the 9 months in which the mother's body is obviously overtaken by the developing baby, during breastfeeding, for example, there's a lot of sort of time and energy that a mother would devote to caring for a newborn